about that. Even just
Yeah,
the
exactly.
title is good. So that's
Meeting is being live streamed. Okay. Yeah, and actually, a couple of people. This actually is happening at the same time as a project meeting. So several of my people are going to the project meeting, but it's recorded, right? So people can find it later.
yes,
Great.
it is. Yeah, and it's posted on YouTube. Yeah.
YouTube, increasing my YouTube fame.
That's right. Yeah, we haven't moved to TikTok yet. Actually, these are probably far too. I don't even know how long that is, but yeah.
That's a good idea, Dan. We should look into that.
I'm sure TikTok is no longer the thing that the young people use. So
We could move it to Snapchat.
Oh God.
all right, well, I'll mute myself and I'll introduce you, Linda, shortly after 11.
Okay, what time are we now? Oh yeah, right now.
1 minute.
Very soon.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending today's CGD seminar. Before we get started, I'll remind everyone of our code of conduct at these seminars, where we share the air, acknowledge teamwork, encourage innovation, show appreciation, consider new ideas, and offer constructive feedback. I'll also ask that everyone please keep themselves muted and hold any questions until the end. If you have a clarification question, you can chat that to me and I can ask it as necessary. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Linda Mearns is Senior Scientist and Section Head of the Regional Integrated Sciences Collective in the Research Applications Lab at NCAR. She received a bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin and master's and PhDs in geography from UCLA. Her research interests include climate change scenarios, analysis and downscaling of regional climate projections and impacts, and analysis of extreme events. She's a fellow of the AMS and has been author and contributor on IPCC assessment reports since the second report. Her talk title today is Should NCAR be more engaged in science directly relevant to the COPs? So Linda, feel free to share your screen and take it away.
Okay. It worked. Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, very glad to be doing this joint CGD RAL seminar. And this topic is of interest to me. As Dan indicated, I've been involved in a number of the IPCC reports, and I've also attended a number of the COPs, which is, if you're not familiar with it, the Conference of the Parties. It's the decision-making entity connected to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I recently was at the COP in Glasgow, Scotland, in November of 2021. And I was thinking more about this because there was more, let's say, regular climate science in that COP, partially because the Working Group 1 IPCC report had come out relatively recently to that. And I just thought it might be nice to consider whether or not NCAR should become more involved either in the COPs or research connected to it. So this talk is not solely on the topic of should NCAR become engaged in research directly relevant to the COPs. That's part of it, but here's the outline. I'm going to discuss the background to where we are in terms of negotiating a mitigation and adaptation regarding climate change, and go back to the Paris Agreement from 2015, then discuss where are we now regarding mitigation and adaptation based on COP26 and the IPCC AR6 reports. Then go on to what are the implications of the failure? What happens if we fail to stay at 1.5 global temperature versus 2? And this is a very central issue, and it really is the framing both for the IPCC reports and for the COPs. And then I'll go on to present some examples of my colleagues at NCAR of relevant research at NCAR. Then pose some questions like, should we be doing more? Should we participate in the next COP, COP27 in Egypt in November? And what are the other options for us participating more centrally in the COPs and the UNFCCC? So, and those are more discussion points. So without further ado, I'll move forward to talk about the Paris Agreement. I'll also mention that I've been to a series of the COPs, and I was at the COP4 where the Paris Agreement was formulated. So here we are, the Conference of the Parties. This was 21 in Paris, 2015. And this was a very, very important Conference of the Parties. These conferences are very large. There's a lot going on at them. There are a lot of side events, pavilions. Many major countries have pavilions where they show displays and do talks. Excuse me. And there's always, come on, move to the next slide. There's always an element of good humor there. So for example, here's a slide from an affiche in the Paris Metro put up by Ben and Jerry's, and it says, when it's melted, we are screwed, with cows and things floating in the water. So this is the typical kind of tongue-in-cheek or not so tongue-in-cheek humor that you'll see at these COPs. So I'm going to give you the basics of what the Paris Agreement are. So centrally, it aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C. It also hopes that the global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions will happen as soon as possible, and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with the best available science. And so I should emphasize that the IPCC and the UNFCCC are, very closely allied. A very important concept of the agreement is the intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs or just NDCs. And these are the pledges that different countries make about how much reduction in greenhouse gases they will promise to make. So the current pledges, that is back in 2015, was to limit the carbon to 55 gigatons of carbon. But of course, greater reductions to 40 gigatons would be necessary to keep us at 1.5 degrees. And then at this COP, there were different countries I just listed here, the US at that point was intending to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. And the EU was going to go forward with 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. Now, it's important to understand that there are no enforcement mechanisms involved in these agreements. And that is obviously problematic. But it is the way it is. I'm kind of fumbling there for a minute. I think it's basically, I mean, pressure can be brought to bear on countries, and it is. So it's not as if there's no pressure, but it's not a very explicit pressure. Now, an important concept that is central to the UNFCCC is this idea of detection and attribution, loss and damage. And this is interesting, and I'm bringing this up because it's clearly an area where the science and the policy become very closely entwined. So, of course, detection and attribution, determining if we can see a climate signal in various variables, particularly extreme events. And there's a very strong, as you know, very strong research community involved in this. And the attribution of the extremes to anthropogenic effects on climate, i.e. heat waves, hurricanes, that may cause damage to the human systems is very important because of the issue of who is held responsible for the damage that results from the increased greenhouse gases. And there's this fraction of attributable risk, which considers the probability of an event in absence of human influence versus the probability with human influence included. And of course, there's been, many, it shouldn't be some, it should be many extremes have been attributed to climate change at different percentages. Now, the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with climate change impacts, this was actually formulated before the Paris Agreement, but it's very relevant to this. And this is formulated in the Paris Agreement in Article 8 of the agreement. It specifically indicates that it does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. And this is a very, very important point, especially to the developed world. And I'll say more about that when we get to COP26. However, it does recognize the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, including weather events and so forth. Some other major points from the Paris Agreement was that it strongly urges developed country parties to scale up their level of financial support to developing countries for mitigation and adaptation. And it was supposed to reach a level of 100 billion annually by 2020. And so one could argue that the whole issue of loss and damage effects could be folded in here, but the developing world doesn't quite see it that way. Anyway, another very important point about the Paris Agreement was, and the phrasing of this was kind of fascinating, it invites the IPCC to provide a special report in 2018 on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial and related greenhouse gas emission pathways. That's really important because a report was produced, sort of known as the 1.5 degree report, and this report has had a tremendous impact on the entire UNFCCC and the way we're viewing climate change and the effects of climate change. Now, I'll tell you an interesting point about this. When this came out, this invitation, of course, once we knew it wasn't really an invitation, they were basically telling the IPCC to do a report. And I thought about this, and I thought particularly about the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And I thought, all right, that's on a global level. Sure, there are much bigger differences on a regional level for extremes and so forth. But quite frankly, my first thought was, this is not going to be worth doing. And even though I've been involved in so many of the reports, I thought, I'm going to sit this one out because I think it's going to be a lot of work and is not going to come up with a lot of definitive science. And in point of fact, I was quite wrong. And it's always very interesting to me when I'm wrong. I mean, it's not as if it's unusual for me to be wrong, but about particular scientific pursuits. I also mentioned down here this presentation by the Hadley Center on Climate Modeling and Important Uncertainties. I mentioned it here because it was, they had a whole side event at the Paris COP. And it's a point that I'll refer back to about ways in which NCAR could contribute. And they did a very, very good side event indicating ways in which climate modeling can really directly figure into the goals of the COP. And this particularly in their case, they were looking at release of methane through melting permafrost. Okay, now we're going to move up to COP26, which took place in Glasgow, Scotland. So this is the pavilion by Tuvalu. And you can see island nations tend to have their acts really together at these COPs. They are on the front lines of the dangers of climate change. And they are often very creative in terms of the way they depict this. So here we have, a penguin being hanged. I'll also mention that the prime minister, I think he's a prime minister of Tuvalu, did a presentation for the COP standing in water off the coast of Tuvalu. And it was an amazingly effective visual indicating the problems for that particular island nation. All right, some of the basics from the COP, some major concepts. Much more than ever before, there was the importance for some concept about climate justice and fairness across the 197 nations making up the COP. Also, there's always an importance of indigenous peoples. The centrality of the IPCC Working Group 1 report was very evident. There were a number of side events about that, and I participated in a couple of those. And that was partially, at least, due to the propinquity of the reports in terms of time, or the COP and the IPCC Working Group 1 report. There was also stressing that the carbon budgets consistent with achieving the Paris Agreement goals are small and being rapidly depleted. And at that point, in November 2021, the world had just about 11 years of burning carbon at the current rate to avoid catastrophic warming. And by that, I mean exceeding 1.5 degree. And interestingly enough, the US was resistant to this statement, but kind of caved eventually. It stresses the urgency of enhancing ambition and action regarding mitigation. And it encourages the further integration to further integrate adaptation into local, regional, and national planning. Now, science versus policy and science and policy. The IPCC reports always make this very distinct difference between policy relevant and policy prescriptive. We're supposed to be just providing the science, and then, of course, the negotiators and policymakers decide what should actually be done. However, that distinction is becoming blurred more and more, I think, when the urgency of climate change continues to strengthen. So for the first time at this COP, the authors of the IPCC Working Group 1 report, and I was one of them, sent a letter to the negotiators urging them to fully acknowledge the most recent climate assessment. Now, that's not revolutionary. It's like just saying, hey, pay attention to our report. It's very important to what you're going to be negotiating. But it went a little bit further than that. And here's a statement. We climate scientists stress that immediate, strong, rapid, sustained, and large-scale actions are necessary to hold global warming to well below 2 degrees C and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5, and therefore limit future risk and needs for adaptation over the next decades to centuries. Now, it was very interesting going through the different drafts of this letter. And some scientists did not want to sign it because they felt it went too far in terms of being prescriptive. But there was a lot of negotiating about the letter, and eventually most people felt comfortable with signing it. And it also included not just the authors of Working Group 1, but we opened it to other climate scientists. But this was really considered a very major action that the IPCC authors actually communicated directly with the negotiators through this letter. All right, I'm going to give you some of the major messages from the final agreement, or the final statements from COP26, and point out why some of these statements are so important. So first of all, the COP recognizes that the impacts of 1.5 degrees C will be much lower than 2 degrees C and resolves to pursue efforts to keep the increase to 1.5 degrees C. And so this is largely, but not solely, based on that 1.5 degree report, which came out in 2018. Although I'll note that there's also a lot more information about this since the IPCC Working Group 2 report was released in, I believe, February. And I was also involved in the Working Group 2 report as well. Then some more basic numbers. Limiting global warming to 1.5 C requires reducing global carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by 2030, relative to 2010, and to net zero by mid-century. And hence the phrase that was bruited about a lot, keep 1.5 alive. There was serious concern that the current NDCs would result in aggregate greenhouse gas levels 13.7% above 2010 level in 2030. In other words, going into the COP, we weren't getting the obligations from the countries sufficient to reduce greenhouse gases to the level that needed to be reduced. And so there's also this need to communicate new and updated nationally determined contributions. One of the points at the COP was to really try to put countries' feet to the fire to get them to up their commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it then requests parties to revisit and strengthen the 2030 targets in their NDCs to align with Paris Agreement temperature goal. And the important point is by the end of 2022, well, the end of 2022, so there we are at the end of 2021, this was also very, very unusual because usually these NDCs are updated every 5 years. And here, because of the urgency, it was now being demanded that further NDCs be established by the end of 2022, which would be at the time of the COP27. And then there are more numbers, critical numbers. Pledges before COP26 would result in warming of 2.7 degrees C. The new pledges done at the conference would lead to 1.8 degrees C. But this is, of course, assuming that all of these pledges were actually implemented, which is another problem. The COPs are fascinating because this really is the negotiating part of it is, of course, done by diplomats. And it's just very interesting to be aware of the attention to language. And some of the negotiations are given in the blue zone where, you know, regular people are, not the negotiators. And the wordsmithing and the focus on the words and the details on that is just amazing. And it's pretty obvious one of the things you need to be a negotiator is an incredible amount of patience. So this next point was this debate about a statement about accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, recognizing the need for support toward a just transition. Now, what happened here was that there was a big debate about the phrase phase out, which was what it originally was, versus phase down. And it finally ended up becoming phase down because India and China, certainly two of the major polluters in the world, really objected to phase out. And there was just a very, very long debate about this. And, you know, to me, obviously I see there's a difference, but it seems kind of trivial because this all depends upon what's actually finally implemented and what city-states, what countries actually do. But this was a very, very big deal at the convention. There was also important further progress, further actions to reduce by 2020 other greenhouse gas emissions. One of the great successes was the methane reduction pledge. 104 countries agreed to reduce methane by 30% by 2030. Okay, and then finally, the importance of maintenance of nature and ecosystems to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, i.e. ceasing deforestation and encouraging afforestation. And that was very important. And I forgot to put it up here because there was another agreement about ceasing deforestation within a certain time period. That was very good to see. Now, getting back to, oh, not quite. This is another part about building capacity for mitigation and adaptation, finance, and particularly financed by, of course, the developed world to help the developing worlds. And so the body notes with deep regret the failure of developed countries to mobilize jointly $100 billion per year by 2020 in the context of meaningful mitigation action for developing countries. This did not happen by 2020. So these failures happen all the time. I think, however, the amount amassed was about 80 billion. So this was trying to really push to 100 billion. And then also notes with concern. There are a lot of statements about with concern, with deep regret and so forth. that the current provision of climate finance for adaptation in developing countries is woefully inadequate, and basically developed countries really need to step up. Now, returning to the loss and damage again. So developing countries, I've gotten really good at pushing this point. So the COP acknowledges that climate change has already caused and will increasingly cause loss and damage. And there's a lot about this, of course, in the IPCC Working Group 2 report. Urgency of scaling up action and support for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with climate change in developing countries. Well, what does addressing loss and damage really mean? And once again, this becomes this issue of who's supposed to pay for the loss and damage. Certainly, the developing world did not contribute that much to climate change, but they are the part of the world that's going to suffer most. So it was decided to establish the Glasgow Dialogue between parties to discuss arrangements for funding of activities to address loss and damage. And again, there are wording differences that I won't go into that are kind of hard to parse, but some developed countries, including the US, UK, and EU, objected to language that would hold them accountable for damage. And this ends up being a very, very important point. And it's amazing how important it is to the US. And the explanation for that is that the US is afraid of getting sued by basically everyone in the world for producing the greenhouse gases that are ultimately changing the climate and causing damage. Interestingly enough, only Scotland stepped up to provide actual funding for this facility. And this issue, yeah.
This is the 30-minute reminder you requested.
Oh my God, that's really frightening. Okay, well, time to speed up a bit. And this will likely be a major issue at COP27. This issue of loss and damage is not going to go away. And even though the US is maintaining a very hard line that they are not going to admit any blame for the loss and damage, if that implies having to pay for it. Okay. So we're now getting to, wait a minute, what happened to you? Come on. So this is the area of talking about the risks. This is going back to the special report, the 1.5 report, establishing the risks, how different the risks are for 1.5 and 2 degrees. And these diagrams showing changing risks, obviously, as the colors get warmer, the risk is much higher. And I'll just point out some of the difference, some that we obviously, that you all certainly know about, which is the warm water corals, which are already very seriously affected. Another one, small scale, low altitude fisheries. The difference between 1.5 and 2 is important, and there's very high confidence that that effect would be dramatic. The Arctic region, again, a big difference between 1.5 and 2. Let's see. Coastal flooding, again, a large difference. And these diagrams of increasing risk are very common in the SPM report. Another typical thing, hot days, 1.5 versus 2. Here's the difference, hot days defined as the 95th percent of daily days, 90 days above the 95th percentile. And you can see here the difference in the 2 versus 1.5 in terms of the number of hot days is substantial, and that's going to be basically a nonlinear function. Okay, risks to marine organisms. Again, the warm water corals are really in trouble. I'm going to point out the pteropods, high latitude pteropods. Pteropods, if you don't know it, are Specialized free-swimming pelagic sea snails and sea slugs, they tend to be kind of translucent. They're a very important food source in the food chain, particularly for salmon. And you can see, once again, 1.5 versus 2 is quite dramatic. And we recently had a big problem with pteropods on the west coast of the US. They're particularly affected by the increased acidity of the oceans in terms of destroying their very thin, delicate shells. Okay, moving on to the Working Group 2 report. North America freshwater risks. These little symbols on the side here indicate a degree of confidence. So this is medium confidence, but all of them clearly increase. Some of them certainly increase between 1.5 and 2. And then as we go further up, it gets much, much worse. But there are differences between, for example, the freshwater scarcity versus the water quality impact. So I'm going to go quickly through the Working Group 3 mitigation. They looked at recent developments and current trends, system transformations to limit global warming, linkages between mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development, strengthening the response. There's also a greater emphasis on CDRs, carbon dioxide removal, as a means of controlling greenhouse gases. So here's just a quick look at the current trends from 1990 to 2019 for the different greenhouse gases. And obviously, they've all continued. This is greenhouse gas emission percentage starting at 1%, 100% for 1990. And they all continue to go up. Global greenhouse gas emissions of 4 modeled pathways. You've seen this, it's somewhat more sophisticated, and it's very much tuned to, again, the 1.5 to the 2 degrees. All right, so this path is limiting the warming to 2 degrees C or returning to warmer after a high overshoot. And then these are paths with lower overshoots or none. And here's your standard diagram of what happens with these different scenarios. These are the different scenarios based on their limits of 1.5 versus 2. And obviously, you get to very high limits with some of these. So the final conclusion of this report was, without a strengthening policies beyond those that are implemented by the end of 2020, greenhouse gas emissions are projected to rise beyond 2025, leading to a global warming of 3.2 with a range by 2100. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that the Working Group 3 report that just came out, of course, because it's dealing with looking at the literature, it's really kind of less advanced than what was presented in the COP agreement, because it's basically starting with information coming out in 2020. Okay, now moving quickly, I hope, on to a few examples of what NCAR is already doing. And when I say, what is it doing? You can say that, well, all climate research and all climate change research would be contributing to the goals of COP. Just checking the time. And I got some slides from a number of colleagues whom I knew were doing work on this. And I'm going to present just a few of these: the NCAR Community Climate Interventions, CCIS, an adaptation study from RAL, and then an alternative energy research work also from RAL. So CCIS, I got these slides from Peter Lawrence. Its basic goal is to develop actionable research to understand the effectiveness and impacts of a portfolio of climate intervention strategies that, combined with mitigation and adaptation, achieve a climate-safe future for human and natural systems. And I'm going to present a very quick example of carbon dioxide removal through re-afforestation. And cutting to the chase here, this is just defining terms. The basic final result of this is from generating maximum plausible reforestation, afforestation, and restoration scenarios compared with the baseline scenarios, you end up with a total from global reforestation, afforestation, and restoration of, the carbon restoration. The total is 139 petagrams of carbon. This is going out from 2015 to 2100. And I'm not doing the study justice at all. So the point is that reforestation, afforestation, these experiments are very interesting to demonstrate how far we could get with reforestation. And this harkens back to COP26, because that was one of the statements that made that this commitment to stop deforestation and try to promote afforestation. The adaptation study is one done by Oliwell Henley and colleagues, urban heat risks in a changing climate. It's a study that's been going on for a long time. And they really got into looking at adaptation for Houston. What's interesting about this, of course, temperatures have gone up by various scenarios. Of course, the heat index will go up in the mid-century climate. But what's interesting about what they did, they looked at a lot of things: vulnerability, urbanization, population, and the interactions between some of these things, and the climate, of course. And ultimately, the future increase in heat-related mortality in Greater Houston is largely driven by changes in population and vulnerability, not climate. Community-based adaptation strategies aiming to reduce social isolation are the most effective and the least challenging to implement across all scenarios. So this is kind of very interesting in terms of really emphasizing the role of looking at features of vulnerability. The climate is still important, but human factors such as poverty, vulnerability, and so forth, and social capital are, at least for Houston, more important. All right, the last example, I'm going to just rush through here. These are some AI techniques looking at changes in wind and solar resources. And obviously, alternative energy sources are very important for succeeding in mitigating greenhouse gases. I'm going to race through that. This is just an example of projected change in wind speed by season to see what wind speed, where one would find greater wind resources, let's say in the future. Okay, now, I kind of rushed through some of this, but I wanted to make sure we had time for a bit of a discussion. And one of the points is, should NCAR be doing more? And by that, I mean, in terms of direct research that directly is relevant to COP, as opposed to just, and I don't mean just in a trivializing sense, all of the climate research that is done at NCAR. So one of the things I'm considering, and I've got a small group of NCAR scientists to discuss these possibilities, is should NCAR try to have a formal participation at COP27, which would happen next November in Egypt. And I've just listed some possibilities here. One is just NCAR scientists could attend. And for the first time for COP26, I happen to be the head of delegation for NCAR UCAR. I actually got applications from other NCAR scientists. And this is the first time that that's happened. So the lowest bar is some NCAR scientists could attend. We could also work to create a side event focusing on NCAR. That might be a hard lift. NCAR could partake in a larger side event, for example, in the US Pavilion. And some of these things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. NCAR could prepare for future COPs through having new research streams, because there are COPs essentially every year. So this is pretty much what I wanted to present. I know I've gone through a lot of this kind of quickly, but I'd be very interested in entertaining. I think that's it. Is that it? Oh, yes, my New Yorker slide. To entertain your questions and find out what you think of these possibilities and so forth. So thanks very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Linda, for that presentation. We have time now for some questions and discussion. So I'd invite people to raise your hand, or you can enter something in the chat if you prefer me to read that aloud. Question from William, go ahead.
Yeah, Lynn, this is Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Great talk. What's the contribution of the ever-expanding built environment to climate change? You don't hear about that as much as probably we should, given how it's changing the specific heat of the Earth with a lot of the materials that are being used. What's happening on that front?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Bill. There's much more attention to that given, particularly in the Working Group 2 report. And I couldn't tell you offhand. I was kind of focusing on big picture part, but there's a whole urban environment chapter in Working Group 2, and certainly it's increasing. The effects of the built environment is certainly increasing urban heat islands. But there's also a lot of, adaptation for urban areas is also increasing very rapidly. For example, in New York City, in terms of providing more green space and painting roofs white, and also, of course, having urban gardens on the tops of buildings. So I can't give you the specific number, but a very good question.
Thank you. All right, question from Cassie, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I don't have a question. I have a comment. Linda, I think this is really great. And I'm super excited to see the presentation on the COPs. I attended COP 14 in Poznan, Poland, and COP 16 in Cancun, in two very different capacities. And then when I was doing my PhD at Emory, I also worked with Emory University to get them observer status to the COPs. I mean, these have kind of, as a young and early career scientist, these opportunities have really accelerated my place in my field of environmental epidemiology. And I think they are exceedingly useful in so many different ways. And if there's anything I can do, I would love to participate in any capacity. So thank you for bringing this up today. And I'm also happy to share my experiences in both Poland and Cancun, which was, many, many years ago.
And the climate has changed since, certainly.
Exactly. The focus has changed from mitigation very quickly to adaptation. And so thank you.
Thanks very much for your comment.
Thanks, Cassie. Dave Lawrence is next. Go ahead.
Yeah, Linda. So my question relates to actually participation with the COP, and I guess I don't have a good sense of what you do or what an NCAR scientist would do. I can imagine that it'd definitely be interesting, and I could go in as an observer and learn stuff. But I guess I felt like, is that a really good, just because I'm interested isn't necessarily a great reason to go. I need to hopefully have some sort of impact if I or anyone was going to go. And so how can you characterize the impact that you or others might have on what's going on at this gigantic conference.
Yeah, I mean, your question is, I think, a typical question that a scientist would ask. What's the point of going to just observe? And I think that can be very rewarding. It's only been in the last COP where I was actively part of some of the side events, partially because of my role in the IPCC. And that was great to actually doing presentations and so forth. And as I indicated earlier, the UK Met Office has done a brilliant job of situating themselves to be relevant at the COP. And that's why, I'm trying to really think about how could NCAR have a stronger presence. It doesn't have any presence right now. And so I'm working with this group about this, but I want to encourage you, I think it's a very valuable experience in and of itself to just see how the science and the policy interact, and also to get really a lot greater rich detail about how different countries are approaching this problem and how they are positioning their science to try to add solutions. So my hope is that, we will be able to do something so that NCAR, UCAR, perhaps in combination with other US entities, will have an actual presence there. But I would also just encourage you to recognize that just going is, quite frankly, an amazing experience. There's nothing like it in the world. It's nothing like going to the AGU or the AMS. It's a completely different event.
Okay, thank you. Tim Schneider is next. Go ahead, Tim.
Hey, Linda, great talk. You and I have had the good fortune to chat about some of these things.
Yes.
But maybe a quick comment and a quick question, but, obviously this is science intersecting with policy. And I've been fortunate in my career to be able to participate in things like the AMS Summer Policy Colloquium, which is obviously US centric, but I found it helpful in understanding how science and policy can intersect. So if folks are interested in this, that's an opportunity. I've kind of lost track of where they are in the cycle, but it's really a great opportunity. The question, Linda, for you is, and I'm sure AGU and others have similar kinds of opportunities as well. But anyways, the question for you, Linda, is, you talk in sort of the mitigation and adaptation aspect of this, we talk about reforestation and whatnot, but, a forest isn't a tree or a collection of trees, it's an ecosystem. And as you know, there are similar international efforts dealing with the concerns of the loss of biodiversity. And I'm just wondering, how that, I don't think you can reforest without, being concerned about biodiversity and an intact ecosystem as opposed to just a tree farm. So how does that intersect with COP, and what do you, what, if anything, could you share about those two kind of major concerns? Some would argue we're in the sixth great mass extinction the planet has experienced.
Wow. Well, yeah, I think, quite frankly, I'm far from an expert in this. So I really don't know the details of what kinds of reforestation or afforestation plans are out there. But certainly, I agree with you that, tree farms would do something, but from a biodiversity point of view and maintaining ecosystems, not so much. So I'll give you I don't know. Sometimes it's really good to just say, I don't know.
Yeah, but I think there are some in the NCAR community who may, right, Linda? So there's an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter Lawrence, for example.
Yeah. I'll just note from a phenological standpoint, my aspen trees in my yard here in the Front Range had catkins in December. I've never seen that before.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
All right, we have a question from Sanjeev Kumar in the chat. Great talk. What specific knowledge gap is could NCAR intend to fill at COP, or is there any identified knowledge gap that COP has identified and NCAR can address?
Excellent question. I think, for example, the work that Peter Lawrence and others are doing in the CCIS is certainly a very good example of what NCAR can be doing. You can say, well, they're already doing it. I think there's a lot of work that could be done. I didn't say as much as I wanted to about adaptation, but adaptation work, such as what Olga Wilhelmi is doing, we've done work as well for adaptation. That's a very, very rich area that also involves multiple spatial scales. And certainly with all the climate and regional climate modeling that NCAR does, I think it could be, I can imagine, just the top of my head, several spatial scale of adaptation projects that could be out there. I think that's something, I think it's a very important question, and I think it'd be interesting to have a discussion with NCAR scientists about that, if there was an interest in trying to develop some further science programs or initiatives within NCAR that could fill some of those gaps. I mean, there are just many, many gaps. I think it's really fascinating to me, for example, the emphasis on the 1.5 versus 2, and doing more work on what a difference it makes, because that immediately feeds into the urgency. And if it really makes a difference to pteropods, for example, if we get to 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees, it'd be really great to know that. And these are things that could easily be done, not easily, but would be very open to having collaborations across various university communities. So yeah, key question.
Okay, thank you. Olga is next.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Linda. That was very interesting. Related to the previous question, I was wondering if you can comment about organizing side events at COPs. What does it take? I participated in COP 11 in Montreal, and NCAR at that time had a side event where we presented on our climate data visualization and GIS portals, but I was not part of the organization. So I was just wondering what kind of topics would be appropriate for the side events.
Well, I mean, and this is what we're discussing, and I certainly would like to, I just started with a small group, but I'd certainly like to, expand that group for further discussions about the side events. They can be, I've explored this a bit through the USGS. I'm on their advisory board. It's not, I think the big effort, let's say for COP27, is going to be over the summer. The easiest might be to connect to the US pavilion. And thank goodness we have a pavilion again, because of course, in the previous administration, we had nothing, which was very depressing. So I think it can be shaped in any number of ways. I think the whole adaptation thing, I think looking, for example, if NCAR does any research about the effects of melting permafrost in terms of methane release. I mentioned that in terms of the UK Met Office, but that's still a very, very important topic that we don't have nailed down at all. So I think there's any numbers of topics that we could craft into a side event. And it's a question of getting connected with the right people. And I'm talking to a couple of people in the State Department about how to do it. It's not, I haven't found it to be that easy. It's partly the question of finding the right person to talk to. And these side events are not really being organized yet, but I'd love to talk to you in particular about how we could move forward with that. It's a non-trivial lift, but I think it could certainly be done. Even with the research we already have now, without talking about changing our research to make it more COP friendly, shall we say. But yeah, great point. And let's talk more about that.
All right, we're approaching the top of the hour, but Peter, if you have a quick question, you're up next.
Oh, thanks a lot, Dan. And Linda, great talk. I just wanted to respond to what Mike was raising about, the whole idea of ecosystems and biodiversity. And when we do the scenarios that Linda put there, some part of it is the carbon cycle side of it, but we also do this in concert with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and also what's called IPBES, which is is looking at the biodiversity and ecosystem services from an intergovernmental perspective. We really understand as well that there are huge land trade-offs in terms of food production and other forms of biodiversity. So when we're doing this, we're looking at plausibility, but we're not being prescriptive and saying, yes, the whole world becomes one big tree farm. It has to be done in a very sustainable manner. I just wanted to throw that out there. So thanks.
Thanks, Peter. We will be talking more about all of this clearly.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Linda, once again for the talk and for starting this discussion. I see there's some other questions and some comments in the chat, so I would encourage you all to reach out to Linda afterwards. And I would once again thank everyone for attending the joint CGD RAL seminar today. See you next week.
Thanks very much, everybody. Please contact me.
And Linda, you and I are staying on for a bit. If you
We
have
are.
time. Do you need to take a little break?